Hello, and welcome to episode 5 of my project to build the APC from the film Aliens. In the previous episode, you'll see my 1/24 scale APC with full interior detail finally painted and finished. It came out great, and the lessons learned from the painting and weathering I've carried through to this version of the bigger 1/16 scale radio-controlled APC. When we looked at the colour options for the APC, you'll have seen the filming miniature that came up for auction at Prop Store. This miniature was radio-controlled to be used in the movie. It was based on a 1/10 scale off-road buggy called a Kyosho Scorpion and powered by a Kyosho Le Mans 360E motor. With the resurgence of RC car racing in recent years, Kyosho have re-released the Scorpion for its vintage fans. The Scorpion chassis used in the movie has of course been heavily modified. I'll be going down a similar route in this video, but with something a bit more accessible, efficient and economical than the Scorpion. Okay, let's crack on with the APC. The 1/16 APC is a really big beast, and I've designed the hull to be printed in 4 sections. These are designed to be printed on my Ultimaker FDM printer in ABS. I chose ABS for its lightweight, durability and dimensional stability rather than going down the resin printing route. There are some really tough resins out there, but I decided to stick with what I know works. I knew I'd have a lot of cleanup to do, but the large prints would come out without any fear of distortion. On the slicer, the prints were easy to set up for printing, with minimal wall thickness and a standard 25% infill. The problem was the print time. Each section took about 4 days to print, which was way slower than resin printing, but the parts came out great in the end. I tried to design the parts with minimal supports. This was fine for the middle sections, but it was unavoidable for the ends. Here are the prints as they came off the printer, with no cleaning up. There are holes at the joins for the locating pins to join the sections together and ensure perfect alignment. The nose section has a lot of support and finishes off the main hull prints. Removing supports is always fun, and these FDM supports come away like a ribbon, eventually. There's always bits left, but these are all on the inside, so it doesn't matter too much how far I go with the cleaning up. The nose section is just the same, but the supports are a bit harder to reach, so I have to use the pliers. But eventually, I get everything out, leaving the shell behind. Again, it's a bit of a mess inside, but that doesn't matter too much, as it won't be seen on the final model. I decided a cleaner way of supporting the openings where the main door and grille panels were was to add a thin solid panel. These panels were then easily cut out with a drill bit in a Dremel. This may sound a bit crazy, but it is easier to remove material down to a clean edge than have messy supports and end up having to rebuild edges. To join the hull sections together, I'm just using ABS printer filament, cut into lengths. I print with 2.8mm filament, so that's what I'm making the pins from. The holes are then drilled out to accept the pins, which were initially superglued into just one side of the join between the two parts. I'm using plenty of superglue here, just to make sure nothing moves. This is the front wheel arch section of the hull. With all the pins in, it's time to bond all the sections together. Again, lots of superglue, spread all over the mating surfaces. These parts were test fitted together several times before committing with the glue. Sometimes the joint needs to be held and spray activator used to stop it springing apart. I then know the joint is permanent and can move on to the next one. I started from the back as the end is flat and it's easier to stack all the hull sections this way. Finally, the nose section is glued into place and the hull is in one piece at last. The joins are obviously pretty prominent at this stage, but getting brutal with a coarse file gets the hull to a good starting point for filling and sanding. Then it's out with the car body filler. Most of the hull will see some of this. Whether it's levelling areas to remove steps, blending sections, filling dips or print lines, this is the most effective method I've found. The filler goes off quickly and is easily sanded. You just have to keep going until everything is smooth. This fill, sand, repeat routine went on for quite a while, so let's turn our attention to the chassis and running gear. This is my Tamiya Porsche GT3. You may have seen my full build video on this car from a couple of months back. This is going to be my donor vehicle. Under the body shell is a fully ball-raced Tamiya TT-02 chassis. These have been around for a few years now, are four-wheel drive, readily available, and not too expensive. I've run mine for quite a while now. It's a great car, lots of fun, very reliable, and you can get loads of upgrades for it. Right now, there's a few parts that we won't be needing. The wheels and tyres are the first to go, as are the body mounts and bumpers. I'm taking this chassis back to just the essentials. And here it is, just the basics. It is mainly plastic, but I replaced the shocks with aluminium aftermarket ones, which were a bit more robust. We can't change the width of the TT-02 chassis, but we can change its length. I bought this stronger glass reinforced chassis for the next stage of this conversion. I could have stuck with the ABS version, but this was only a few pounds extra and I wasn't sure how much I'd be weakening the original, so I went for it. They are identical shapes, but have a slightly different finish, and on the moulding data plate you can see they have an indicator to show what material it's made from. You can either have straight ABS, ABS with glass fibre, or ABS with carbon fibre. Fortunately, every TT-02 kit comes with two central prop shafts, which is handy. I need to make one long prop shaft, and by cutting it in two and fitting each end into an aluminium tube, we have a solution. Of course, we need to know exactly how long to make the prop shaft, and both ends have to be secure, otherwise this just won't work. With the tubing cut and some studding screwed into one end of the prop shaft, the tube can be slid over and the other end screwed in tight. The tube works really well, keeping the prop shaft straight and true. There's even adjustment, as the ends can be screwed in or out to take up any free play. Next, we need to carry out some major surgery on the chassis. Tape is carefully wrapped around the chassis for layout, then a cut line is drawn right around at its widest point. This must be carefully drawn square with the chassis. Holes are also drilled 15mm either side of the cut line. These are to hold the chassis down when cutting and are crucial for alignment when the chassis is reassembled. Then it's onto the bandsaw and the cut is made. A friend with a steady hand cut the chassis for me and got it dead on. A really clean cut. To extend the wheelbase by the necessary 50mm, an extension was designed and 3D printed in ABS on my Ultimaker FDM printer. This was designed to match the original TT-02 chassis cross-section. The holes we drilled earlier serve as the alignment and fixing points, ensuring the correct spacing of the two halves of the chassis. The spacer just needs some cleaning up and a coat of paint to make it look pretty. After some sanding and scraping, it gets a coat of primer. I had this red going spare, so gave it a blast with that. Once dried, the spacer got a finishing coat of satin black to match the rest of the chassis. As you can see, it looks pretty good against the original. Now all I have to do is join everything together. To attach the extension, I'm using pop rivets in the alignment holes. The careful measuring from before ensures everything lines up perfectly. The APC isn't going to be fast with the chassis under a lot of load, so this method of securing the chassis with pop rivets is perfectly adequate. And here it is, with the 4 primary rivets joining the chassis back together. Quite a neat job, and will be completely hidden beneath the hull of the APC. I then built up the drivetrain and suspension, adding the prop shaft I'd lengthened earlier. I also added 4 more rivets to the chassis sidewalls to provide further rigidity. Quite a tidy job so far. Now for the wheels and tyres. The tyre I 3D printed on my resin printer, carefully supporting it to ensure all the tread blocks printed successfully. There were a lot of supports, but they all broke away cleanly. Sure, there was going to be some cleaning up, but at least I had a decent tyre. But a tyre printed in resin was going to be useless for a functioning RC version of the APC. I know there are resins out there that are rubber-like, but they are expensive and difficult to print, so I plan to go down another route. The tyre was designed to slip over the FDM printed wheel hubs I was going to use. These had been carefully designed to create the correct offset for the wheels, so they sat in the right place relative to the hull of the APC. Magnets would be fitted to the hubs to invisibly attach the outer wheel discs. So I could remove these discs without damaging them. The hubs had holes going right the way through, which I could then push a rod through to push the wheel discs off the hubs. The FDM printed wheel hubs need a bit of cleaning up, so I just used my drill bit in a Dremel to remove any support material. The rest of the hubs were then carefully cleaned up to make them ready for paint. This wasn't really necessary, but I wanted my APC to look like a factory fresh model. And here it is, with the wheel hubs painted satin black and the radio and battery installed. I'm just using the standard Tamiya motor and ESC that came with the TT-02, powered by a 2S LiPo battery. I have had to cut some of the material out of the corners of the chassis to clear the hull, but given the speed at which the APC will be going, I don't think it'll affect its handling. There are a lot of hop-up parts you can get for the TT-02, but for this build the basic kit was good enough. With the tyre master fully cleaned up, a silicone mould was made so we could cast rubber tyres. The chunky nature of these tyres should make this process fairly straightforward. To cast these tyres we're going to use Polytech PT Flex 70 casting rubber with a black pigment. There are a few grades of this rubber and this one is one of the firmest. It mixes 1:1 by weight with 0.5% of pigment. The only downside is the pot life. This stuff goes off fast. Fortunately, I have a good friend who's an expert at resin casting. Pouring from the back edge of the tyre, we got a great result. This edge won't be seen, but I will try and clean it up as best I can, just in case. I was very excited when I got these. The quality is fantastic. They are absolutely perfect. Thanks, Kevin. To mount the hull onto the chassis, I'm going to use magnets. These rare earth magnets are super strong, but very brittle. I spent too much time playing with them and broke a couple, so be careful. To house them in the main hull, I printed these tubes. They're to be glued into the hull in specific locations to accept the magnets, which will then be superglued into the tubes. Corresponding brackets for the chassis magnets are also FDM printed in ABS. These are designed to be screwed onto the standard TT-02 body mounting brackets. The prints came out well and the magnets fitted perfectly. It is very important to have a clear plan to get the magnets the right way round at all times. Otherwise they'll repel and you won't get the connection you need. Finally, after a few days of filling and sanding, I was happy enough with the hull to give it a first coat of primer. This would show me where the hull needed more attention and was just a first pass. The underside was sprayed first. As you can see, I've worked out how much of the hull I need to cut away to clear the chassis. The final STL files will already have these cutouts. The hull magnets have also been glued in place at this stage. With the underside dry, the hull is flipped and the upper surface is primed. This looks so much better than the patchy filled print we started with. Now I just have to tidy it up and move on to the next stage. And this is the hull, finally filled, sanded and primed. At last I have a finish I'm happy with. The edges are sharp and the surfaces are flat, just like a real APC. Now I need to add all the detail parts. Most of these parts are just enlarged from the 1/24 scale model, which has loads of detail. I did take the opportunity to add some more detail to the vents of the rear of the hull though. All of these parts were printed on my resin printer and printed well without any issues. They were all easily removed from their supports. Of course, I had to take care with the smaller, more delicate parts, but that's to be expected. These are some of the main exterior parts I'll be adding prior to spraying. The doors and side vents need a bit of cleaning up before permanently fitting to the main hull. The rails for the turret were printed on my FDM printer as they were vulnerable to damage and my basic resin would just break too easily. Of course, I could have gone for a tougher resin. The clear cast resin tail lights had a few bubbles in, but I just filled them with superglue, sprayed them with activator and sanded them down. They'll look perfectly fine when painted up on the finished model. Of course, this is just an option for lighting. You could just go with the standard lights and paint them. The photo etching for the 1/16 APC is then just cut away from the fret. Some of these parts will need some preparation prior to being fitted to the hull. The photo etch parts will be available to resin print as an alternative, but being so delicate will be very vulnerable to damage. Here's the searchlight grille and front details folded up and ready for priming. The two front toe shackles I also felt were vulnerable, so I made a silicone mould and cast them in white metal. You can see exactly how I do this in episodes 1 and 2 of my how-to series. They need a bit of cleaning up, but they'll be perfectly fine. And these are all of the smaller parts, cleaned up and ready for attaching to the main hull. The toe shackles look great, and they won't break. The etching is nice and crisp, and the resin prints have all been cleaned up. The main turret I FDM printed on my Ultimaker, as I wanted to keep the weight down. There is a limit to how much weight the magnets will hold when the turret is in the stowed position on the rear of the hull. The magnets were a great solution for attaching the turrets. The base mount for the front turret will be glued to the hull, and then the magnets will hold the turret in place. The gun barrels for the main turret are held on with pins, and then the turret will be held onto the trolley with magnets, which will also attach it to the hull in both positions. I'm using microcrystal clear to glue the clear styrene to the windscreen frame. Once dried, I can then just cut the excess away with scissors, so it's ready to fit to the hull. All the detail parts are now fitted to the hull, and the windscreen and tail lights are masked off, ready for primer. The wiring for the rear lights has been installed, and the channels filled and sanded back. I used the same micro LEDs in the tail lights for the 1/16th model as I did for the 1/24th. Once the details are primed, the next stage will be paint. The now complete upper turret was also primed, having had the magnets glued into place. It was just a quick touch-up to prime the rest of the hull parts before I could move on to the next stage. The interior and the wheel arches were given a coat of matte black from a rattle can. This would hide any distractions inside the APC and also pre-shade the wheel arches. Then I could begin laying down some colour. As mentioned in the previous episode, I'm spraying the APC with Tamiya XF27 Black Green as a base colour. The underside of the turrets and trolley are sprayed first, allowed to dry and then flipped over so the upper surfaces can be sprayed. Then it's onto the main hull. There is so much to cover. I think I got through 4 bottles of black green on this 1/16th scale version. Fortunately, the Tamiya paint was spraying straight from the bottle without any problems. With the underside dry, I moved on to the upper surface, just trying to get a good solid base coat down. There was a lot of comment about the colour choice in the comments on the last video. The consensus from you guys was that the filming miniatures for the APC were painted brown to compensate for the on-set lighting, which on-screen would result in a greener colour. My colour choice was to go for the on-screen colour to match the full-sized APC used in various scenes. With everything base coated, I then moved on to the XF13 Japanese Army Green to model the entire model. After the 1/24th model, I knew exactly what I was doing, so this was way less sketchy. I actually got in the zone and really enjoyed it. After the turrets, the hull and wheel discs all got the same treatment. Once the mottling was dry, I then applied the stencils for the front of the APC and sprayed them in an off-white, in thin coats. Once dried, I could then carefully remove the masking tape and stencils to reveal the finished markings. Everything then got a coat of matte varnish to seal and protect the model. As this is a functioning RC model, I went for a decorator's dead flat varnish for added durability. Once that was dry, I then used my favourite combination of French ultramarine and burnt umber oils in varying mixes to add a variety of effects to the hull. Once I was finally happy, everything got another coat of dead flat varnish. I know it looks pale blue, but it does dry clear, trust me. Again, I brought out my trusty 6B graphite stick to add wear and scratch marks to the exposed edges. I do love this technique, it's quick, easy and very effective. The tyres I actually primed with SMS matte black lacquer primer, just on the front and back sidewalls. This is thin, opaque, and dries very quickly. It gives a matte finish to the shiny areas where the rubber was poured, helping to disguise any highlights. The armour plates to the outer faces of the sidewalls were then just picked out by hand in XF27 black-green. And this is how the wheels and tyres go together. The tyres just slide onto the wheel hubs, flush with the back face, and then the outer disc, which has also been weathered and varnished, snaps into place with the magnets. The tyres are then just carefully superglued onto the hubs, in 4 places. We don't need belts and braces here, as they'll be rotating slowly and under very little load. I discovered that with a lot of the hull in front of the front axle, the existing shocks couldn't take the weight, so I bought these upgraded springs. I put the stiffest ones in, but they were still too soft. The only option I had was to pack the damper out inside with a section of silicone tubing. This was a quick and easy modification, and worked really well. There wasn't a lot of point refilling the front shocks with oil, as they were now almost immovable. I put the next stiffest springs I had on the rear, and with the wheels fitted, it was now time to check the lights and fit the hull. I decided to have 2 separate circuits for the lights, each with its own 9-volt battery. The LEDs and wiring were superglued into place, much as the 1/24th APC. The 9-volt batteries were just secured inside the hull with Velcro. These weren't going to fall off, as I wouldn't be taking the APC over any jumps. I didn't want to break the transaxle. Now I just had to marry the hull and chassis. This was really easy. It's a snug fit, but that's exactly what's needed. There's a lot of weight to the hull, and I don't want it moving around. With the APC flipped over, I just have to add the turrets, and the build is complete. Let's get the APC in the studio and see how it looks in front of the camera. The bigger model looks even more convincing than the 1/24th version. At this scale, it's hard to tell whether it's actually the full-size APC or not. I'm really pleased how it's finally turned out. The model is very accurate to the original full-sized APC, and the weathering is very subtle, just noticeable. I wanted it to be freshly deployed from the dropship, so no heavy weathering and chipping for me. I think the APC would suit quite a variety of camo schemes, from green splinter schemes to urban camo. I think the APC could handle them all. Having the turret in the stowed position also works well. I did toy with putting servos in the turrets, but figured I had enough going on already. It would have been pretty cool though. To get some real-world images, I took the APC down to my local beach. I hope you enjoyed this episode of my Aliens APC build. If you did, please share with your friends and make sure you subscribe to my channel. To learn about some of the techniques I use, check out my how-to series to find out more about moulding, casting, CAD design and 3D printing. If you have any questions about this build, just leave them in the comments and I'll get back to you. Thanks for watching.